Well, thank you. I'm going to actually continue in the theme that was present in the first two talks. Work is actually done primarily by Ashley Clendenen, a graduate student in the physics department, and Brant Jones. And then there's really important contributions from Shuai Lee that I want to point out. And Shuai's here, so he can correct me when I say something incorrect. Okay, now I don't really want to spend a lot of time on this, but there are lots of different sources for the water, in particular volcanic eruption, water from pyroclastic materials, the delivery via comets, micrometeorites, or interplanetary dust particles. There's issues with these, but they're for sure source terms. Actually, what I would like to speak about is the lower two topics, which is the idea of the solar wind inducing the formation. I will talk about the implantation of the proton, just like the previous speaker, but I want to point out something that this is actually required, but not sufficient for the production of water. It's sufficient for the production of OH, but not the water molecule. You need a temperature excursion or some activated process for the formation of the water. Unless it's directly interacting with, iron oxide, it's more likely that there's this two-step process. You get a massive temperature increase with micrometeorite bombardment. This does for sure induce a lot of water formation, assuming that you have significant hydrogen implantation. This says Jones's next talk, and he's not talking. I'm giving this overview, which is pretty similar to what you already saw. So when we have a solar wind proton interact with the regolith, it penetrates in due to the stopping power. It loses energy by DEDX, which is sort of an electron energy loss, which is primarily ionization, and implants itself as a hydroxyl. These are the stable signatures for the 3 micron or 2.8 to 3 micron band. This is latitude dependent because it's dependent upon the flux. It's temperature independent. These are very stable. They kind of move around, but what really moves around is the hydrogen atom, but we're not talking about that because that's hydrogen atom motion, and the hydrogen molecule motion isn't observable in the OH stretch. Then this builds up and you get a latitude and temperature dependence of the signal, which Casey was talking about. And then one of the things that happens is the OH groups that you produce by solar wind implantation, they can meet each other and react to form water. And that water can desorb. So that's the temperature effect here. So Brant Jones had a nice model on this for the solar wind cycle. So what is this recombinative desorption? So you want to look at the two things on the corner there in green. Those are two OH groups that are within the material itself. They're produced by the solar wind. If they're next to one another and you have a temperature excursion, which isn't really that high, you can get them to interact with one another, and chemically they can react to form water. So that's a source term for water, which is due to the proton implantation, followed by or concomitant with a temperature increase. And what we showed here on the left is sort of the thermal removal or thermal production of water over the temperature regime, well beyond what a normal diurnal thermal excursion would be. The front end of that is the diurnal excursion, but it goes all the way out to 1200 degrees Kelvin, and that's the temperature range that you would sample in an impact event. So if I have an impact event, I'm absolutely making a lot of water, providing that there's protons that have been planted into the surface. Okay, so we're going to pay attention to that. And one of the things that we actually showed this, but didn't mention it as a sort of a signature of impact events. But what we can do is we can sort of simulate an impact event with a laser irradiating the surface, giving you the thermal spike. And then with another laser, we can detect that water molecule leaving the surface with very high sensitivity in terms of the number density. And we can tune the laser so that we can tell how vibrationally excited it is, how rotationally excited it is, and what the velocity distribution is. And these are signatures of actually forming water. There's a complication of this like spectroscopic term where you actually, if you form a lot of vibrationally excited water, you form two fragments in coincidence with one another. And we were able to map that out and show that, when you have a thermal impact event on an oxide surface, in this case, it was an actual lunar Apollo 16 sample, you can make water, right? So I don't want to go through this in detail, but this is showing you the coincidence measurements that allowed us to understand that the the photon that is simulating an impact event could come and cause these OH groups to interact with one another, form water, and then we detect this with the laser. So what I want to ask is a different question here is, can some of this OH in water be formed by a non-thermal process, which means the electron that's there when the solar wind is hitting interacts? And we have to do that because the solar wind is not just a proton beam. It's a mistake to think that the proton is doing everything, because it is not. And there's a flux of electrons that are at the surface that matter. So this whole thing can be circumvented or short-circuited, if you will, where once I have the protons irradiating the surface and making hydroxyl groups, I can have an electron scatter during this process and make water directly. So we wanted to look at that, and there's a reason to look at that, and this comes out of Shai Lee's work. So we've been talking about this for a number of years, and then he did some really detailed analysis of the M-cube data. And Shai's in the audience, so you got to keep me honest on this. But if you look at the data sets when the moon is moving into the through the magnetosheath, through the magnetolobe, into the plasma sheet and out, he looked at the variation of these optical signatures in the M-cube data, and he finds that it does increase, as you expect, as it goes through the in this dusk part where it goes through the magnetosheath where the proton flux is high. And then the proton flux goes down. So what's being mapped here is the proton flux as you move through the magnetotail. Okay, so it goes up, it goes down, and then comes back up again. When he looked at the data, it didn't follow this, and part of the reason is that you have to look at what the differential electron flux is doing. It's not doing the same thing as the proton flux is. In fact, the differential flux says that there's a lot of keV or lower energy electrons irradiating the moon's surface while the protons are shut off. So that's an interesting situation. So it can allow us to look at directly what the electrons are doing in the absence of the protons. So we looked at this, and the sentiment is that the electrons matter, right? So the data out of the M-cubed is on the top, and you can see this is the water content extracted by Shai out of the M-cubed data. And he can tell you the details of what all these different colors look like, but it does not follow the red line. And the reason for that, in our opinion, is because there is an alternative term that's actually causing the water to either persist or increase, and that is due to the electron flux. And so there's on the bottom here, there's an alternative water formation process other than direct proton bombardment. So it's likely the electrons. So we wanted to look at this in the laboratory because that was observational data. And in the same experimental arrangement that we had for the laser detection, we basically did the same experiment, but we looked directly at the ion signal that was produced, and we were irradiating it with electrons versus a laser. And lo and behold, we see stimulated production of water and stimulated production of water ions after you irradiate these lunar samples with protons, which is consistent with electrons being involved. I don't want to get into the details, but there's some thresholds for forming this. It's a low energy threshold. Dissociative ionization of hydrogen actually seems to be related to this. And there's a temporal dependence, which is related to stimulated diffusion of hydrogen. So we heard about diffusion of hydrogen. This happens, and you can stimulate that diffusion and stimulate reactive scattering with an electron within the penetration depth of the electron. So I'm going to end there. I'm going to point out that thermal spikes, primarily due to micrometeorite impacts, absolutely make water. And these don't have to be very energetic. You just need like a 40 to 50 degree temperature increase to have this turn on. And it's due to the turning on of this hot atom chemistry. And the lower three are very, details of what electronic states are involved, but that's not necessarily the point. The point is that this happens. So on that, I'm going to stop, and thank you.